Grammar is an important part of learning a language, and learners certainly perceive it like that. But actually, vocabulary is a much more important part of the process. Wilkins says that without grammar, little can be conveyed, but without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. I'm Jo Gakonga from ELT Training, and in this series of videos I'm going to be looking at what you need to consider when you're teaching vocabulary. So when we're teaching vocabulary, what do we need to think about? What's going to be difficult for our learners? There's probably more to this than you've initially thought. So let's have a look at those things now. English has got a lot of words, partly because we've been invaded so many times and we've adopted words from different languages. But the average native speaker knows about 40,000 words and probably uses only between 5,000 and 10,000 of those on a regular basis. If you look at all texts, the most common 100 words make up about 40% of everything. And if you know the most common 7,500 words, then that covers about 90% of everything that you'll see or hear. The problem, of course, is that seeing a word, knowing a word, means to know it in all contexts, and one word doesn't necessarily have one meaning. So let's take a nice easy example to start with. Mug. I chose this because there's one right in front of me, and of course your first thought is that it's a noun, but it could also be a verb, to mug someone, and it also has other meanings as a noun. An ugly mug, he's such a mug. And then you've got other related words like mugshot, and there are phrasal verbs like to mug up on something. So the problem is that even something which seems quite simple on the surface has actually got quite a lot of complexity as you dig down a bit. Because of this, as language teachers, we really need to think about the language that we're teaching and what aspects of it are difficult or problematic for learners so that we can help them through this maze. And we do this at the planning stage. As with teaching any language system, it's helpful to think of it in terms of meaning, form and pronunciation. So let's look at these in turn. Let's start with problems related to meaning. Now, the best place to find the meaning is to use a learner dictionary, because this will give us a simple definition. But it will also help you to see what the most common uses of that word are, and also at what level they're usually taught. So there are a few problems. Problem number one is that there's almost certainly more than one meaning of this particular word. Remember that it's a good idea to stick to one meaning at a time. If you're teaching the word at a higher level and you're comparing it with a meaning they already know, that's great. But I wouldn't teach two different meanings at the same time. It's just confusing. Problem number two is that some words have a particular connotation. So they don't just have the denotational meaning, but there's also a kind of feeling about them one way or the other, maybe positive, maybe negative. So if you try and sort these words into order of size, which one's the tallest, you start to come across a few problems. Let's take lanky, for example. It does mean tall, but it also means tall in a kind of a thin way and probably in a bit of a negative way. So we need to make sure that our learners understand this so that they don't offend anyone. Problem number three is register. Some words are just more formal than others. Have a look at these pairs of words. Do they mean the same thing? What you probably notice is that the more formal ones tend to come from French or Latin. So your learners who come from French, Italian, Spanish backgrounds will tend to use the ones that they know, the cognates, and probably end up sounding rather more formal than they really want to. Problem number four is that there are many words which are similar to each other, which are near synonyms. In some contexts, they might mean pretty much the same thing. But remember that there are no words, probably in any language, which are exact synonyms, which mean exactly the same in all contexts, because what would be the point of having two words that were exactly the same? Look at these two words, for example, big and large. Now, in most contexts, these are pretty synonymous. You could use one or the other and it wouldn't matter. But if you bought this t-shirt, you probably wouldn't say it was extra big. And if you were talking to your 5-year-old and telling him he was going off to school now, you probably wouldn't tell him he was a large boy now. Important that your learners know what context they can use the word in. Problem number 5 is about words that look or sound the same as each other. Some words have more than one meaning, but the spelling is the same and the sound is the same. We call these homonyms. This is an example. Other words sound the same, but have a different spelling and obviously a different meaning. Here's another example. We call these homophones. They sound the same. And then, of course, we've got words, these are less common, that are written the same, have the same spelling, but they don't sound the same. So these are homographs. Think about read and read, or bow and bow. So we need to consider these difficulties when we're teaching Lexis. Not all words have all of these problems, but these are the things that we need to look out for and to take notice of if they are a problem for particular words when we're teaching them. Right, now let's move on and have a look at problems with form. In the last part, we looked at the things that you need to think about when you're teaching vocabulary that are problematic with the meaning. So what about problems with form? Spelling, of course, is the big one. English is infamous for its irregular orthography. Look at these words. If this is through, why does this say cough? And if this is below, why does the same O sound have this spelling in coat? Another problem with form to look out for is irregular plurals. So we've got mouse and mice, but no, not house and heis. These aren't very common in English, but some of the ones which are very common words do have irregular plurals. For example, man, men, woman, women, and note the pronunciation of that, child, children, person, people. So if there are irregular plurals, then your learners need to know about that. If we're talking about plurals, there's also the small matter of whether something is count or non-count if it's a noun. Learners often make mistakes with words like advice, advices, no. Information, informations, no. And this might be because they don't know they're non-count or because in their own language they are countable. Problems don't only arise with nouns. If you've got verbs, for example, you need to make sure that they know if there's an irregular past tense and past participle. So if you teach swim, they need to know that if they did it yesterday, it's swam, and that they have swum in a river in the past. Any other problems with form? Yes, I'm afraid there are one or two. If you're teaching adjectives, then you'll often find that the opposite will be formed with unhappy, for example. But what about dishonest, illegal, imperfect? So if these are irregular, then your learners need to know about it. Finally, if learners are going to use a word, then they need to know about the words that go around it. So this is called collocation and colligation. So collocation is to do with the words which fit together with that word. So we can say Merry Christmas, for example, but we can't say Merry Birthday. Why not? It just doesn't collocate in English. It's also useful to think about the kind of words then that we'll need to teach with a word. So if we're teaching smoker, then it's worth teaching a heavy smoker or a social smoker. Colligation is about the grammatical forms that surround a word. So if we're teaching the word love, then we need to make sure that the learners know that it has to have an object. Now, if you're the teacher, you know that's called a transitive verb, but I wouldn't teach that word to my learners. But they need to know that it's I love him, or I love ice cream, or I love running, not I love. Think about words like suggest. If you teach them this, then what else do you need to teach them? What comes after it? I suggest that you do something. I suggest you do something. There are several options afterwards, but you can't just suggest someone, for example. So these are some of the problems that learners might have with form of vocabulary that we need to think about. As you can see, there's quite a bit here. And remember, not all words will have all of these problems, but these are the things that are worth considering when you're planning. Let's move on in the next section to look at problems with pronunciation. We've looked at issues with meaning and form, and so the final aspect of vocabulary that we need to consider is the pronunciation. Obviously, learners need to know how to say a word if they're going to be able to use it, and there are a few problems to consider here too. We've mentioned spelling before, and of course in many cases this is going to give learners a false picture of how the word sounds. This word is enough, and if learners know this, then they're not likely to get that this is pronounced bow. This letter often has an a sound, as in cat, but in this word it says o, was, and in this word it says are, last. Well, I guess that depends on your pronunciation, but it says last for me. So learners need to know this. Another problem with pronunciation is word stress. Polysyllabic words don't have regular stress in English, they do in some other languages. So you need to make sure that your learners know where the stress lies. This can make quite a difference. This word, important, is stressed on the second syllable. But if you stress the same thing on the first syllable, it sounds quite different. Now, there are some regular patterns. For example, all words that end in shun, however that's spelt, have their stress on the penultimate syllable, the one before that shun sound. Think of station, amelioration, politician. So these patterns are worth teaching, but there are lots of patterns, so you can't teach them all, and there are lots of exceptions too. So when you're teaching a new word, you need to make sure that the learners know where the stress lies. There are also problems with some words with shifting stress patterns depending on the form of the word. So this is a piano, but the person who plays it is a pianist. The stress isn't the same. This is an economist, but the car is economical. Often syllables that are not stressed have a weak vowel sound as well. So for example, this is annoyed because the stress is not there, it's not annoyed. By this time, you might be thinking that it's going to take you forever to teach even a small amount of vocabulary. So the next question is, do they need to know all of this for all of the vocabulary that you're going to teach? This is where your judgment as a teacher comes in. So if you're teaching words for receptive purposes, for them perhaps just to understand it in a reading or a listening text, then obviously they don't need to know very much. They only need to know what the word means in that particular context. But if you want them to use the word for productive purposes, then obviously they need a lot more information so that they can use the word accurately. So in that case, you're going to have to think about what sort of issues there are with that particular word and think about how you're going to address those so that they understand. I hope this has been a bit helpful, and have fun with your vocabulary teaching.